Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Grace Covenant Chats, brought to you by Grace Covenant Church here in Philadelphia. I am your host, Caleb Watt, here with not my usual co-host, but our first guest and my current housemate, Pastor Bryan Mun. Pastor Bryan, PB, P. Bryan. All three names work. How are you doing today?
Good. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me as the first guest of the GCC podcast.
First guest. That's I guess, big shoes to not fill, but to create.
Yeah, I don't know what it's going to be like, but I'm excited to just share, talk. Yeah.
Well, I guess part of the reason why we're here today is because you are coming up against the end of your time here at GCC. So I guess it would have been nice to, or it would be nice, not would have, would be nice to just like reflect or talk through some of maybe a little bit of your story, but like also your experience at GCC and maybe some of your hopes for our church in the future. If you ever come back in like 5 years or something, it's like, where would you want GCC to be?
Maybe.
But we can talk about that at the end or later. But yeah, so why don't we start at the beginning? Like, how did you end up here at GCC? And like, yeah, basically, or even we could even go further back into your own personal life story. Like, how did you get the call into ministry? And then from there, like, how did things play out to where you ended up here in Philly?
Yeah, so long story short, I mean, I can share the whole story, but I don't know if anyone wants to hear all of it. But my sophomore year in college is when I felt the call to go into ministry. Pretty much just felt like something you just couldn't run away from. Just a tug in my heart. And so a lot of doubts, a lot of questions. But eventually my sophomore year, I came in as a mechanical engineer, but I felt the calling. So I was like, okay, I want to go into ministry, switch to communications, religious studies. And then it wasn't until a couple years after that where I felt like the Lord was like, hey, go into seminary school. And so went to seminary school to Boston, Gordon Conwell, never stepped foot on the East Coast. It was like one of those weird things where I stepped onto the plane, landed, and I was like, this is the first time I've ever been on the East Coast. You kind of grow up in California. It's like, you don't really know what the East Coast is like, but was there and then ended up church hopping a lot. Went to maybe like 10 different churches and ended up being part of Symphony. Loved the vision of the church, loved the staff there, and then ended up being there for about 2.5 years. And then I graduated from seminary school. I thought I was going to be in Boston. Like it was, I loved Boston, fell in love with the city, fell in love with the people, fell in love with the church. So I was like, oh, I think I'm going to die here. Like, I'm going to bury my grave. I'm going to do ministry here for the rest of my life.
I feel like West Coasters always want to go back to California.
I know. I'm one of those guys that doesn't want to go back. But I loved the East Coast and I loved Boston. So after graduating, I was talking to Pastor Barry, who's the lead pastor of Symphony Church. And he was like, hey, we would love for you to be on staff, but we can't offer you a full-time gig. You would have to go bivocational. But we want to give you a couple other like ministry experiences. So they were like, GCC is looking for a college pastor. It would be full-time. Would you be willing to check it out? So I didn't know anything about Philly. I thought it was like the countryside. Like, I don't know. I was being like really naive. Didn't know anything about Philly. I didn't know it was a city. So I was like, I'm not sure. Yeah, it was, I don't know. I don't know why I didn't think that. California used to think about California. So I was like, maybe. And so ended up visiting and, it's funny because I was planning on going to Philly with some friends. So I remember messaging Pastor Young and I was like, hey, P. Young, can I come like this weekend? We'd love to just check out the church, get to meet different people, the staff there. And he was like, sure. So I like talked to my seminary friends. They were like, oh, we should do a road trip. I was like, oh, that'd be so much fun. Let's do a road trip. But a day later, Pastor Chris sends me an email saying like, hey, here's your itinerary for the next 3 days that you're in Philly. And I was like, whoa, it's kind of intense. So I had to tell my friends, I was like, hey, I don't think you guys should come. I'm going to be busy. So I just drove down by myself and I just fell in love with it. I went to a Saturday servants meeting and just saw people who just really want to be there to serve, who loved Jesus, went to an FNL, was, very memorable. Um, and went to a Sunday service, and just all of it, I was like, this is the church I want to be part of. And after meeting the staff and talking to them, I was like, this is the staff that I want to be a part of. And it felt like too good to be true. Like, I didn't know, sometimes you're like, oh, should I? I'm like, oh, I don't like this. And, I don't know if we're going to be a good fit in this. But after I left that weekend in Philly, I was like, if they want me, I'm down. So they all wanted me to be here. Praise God. And then, that's how I started 5 years ago, like 2017.
2017.
Yeah.
Wow. It's like, it feels almost like a little bit weird, right? Because like when you know how like when you go into like a new life stage or like a new thing, right? The people who are there, usually like even though they haven't been there forever, they just feel like they've been there forever. So it's like you starting 5 years ago was a year before I got to college. So it's like so weird because like you are like a permanent fixture in my mind, right, of GCC.
Yeah.
But like you started a year before I got here. So
Yeah.
It's, like
it's crazy because I remember when I first came, I came in the fall of 2017. And it was the first week when we were having like intro nights. And so I would go to these intro nights, and there was one in Penn for Penn intro night, and I was there, and you know how you have to introduce yourself, and I was like, ooh, I just got here, but I'm the pastor, so I have to be welcoming. And so I would like go to a newcomer. I was like, hey, so how long have you been here? They're like, oh, we just got here. Like, I've been a week. And they're like, how long have you been here? I'm like, me too, So I felt like a freshman all over again. And so it was weird that like, that's where I was. But like now it's been 5 years. And
that was 5 years, half a decade.
I know.
Was this your first ministry like experience outside of like, going to seminary and stuff like that?
Yeah. So pretty much the first full like pastoral ministry.
Okay.
Yeah, because I've done college ministry since I've been in college. Even at Symphony, I was doing a little bit of college ministry, part of Alpha ministry too. But this is pretty much after graduating from seminary school, the first pastoral position.
So did you see yourself going into or doing college ministry for so long?
I did. So because I got my calling in college ministry, I was like, I love college ministry. Like I grew a lot. I went through like so much of like working through my own doubts with the Christian faith, knowing what it means to be a disciple. And then Symphony is such a college, or it used to be a lot more college, but now it's a lot of young adults too, but a lot of college ministry there. And so coming to GCC, I was like, I love college students. Like I felt like I was going to do this for the rest of my life. So that's part of the draw that I liked about GCC. And I was like, there's just a lot of energy, a lot of passion. And I want to be able to pour into the next generation. And so that's why I ended up like being a college pastor here.
Then transitioning out of like, I suppose like seminary and stuff like that. Like what was that like? Right. Moving from like a position of like, taking faith perhaps a little bit more academically and then having to apply it very pastorally. Right. Cause I mean, I don't know much about what it means to be a pastor or like, a theologian or like a seminarian or whatever. But it's like when I look at commentaries, I know that there's one category that's like technical and one for pastors. I'm like, there's clearly a difference. So what was it like moving out of that like sort of space into like a full-time, like now I'm a pastor?
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, it was a bit of transition because seminary school was like such a blur and a grind. It's one of those where I was working, doing ministry, and also going to full-time school. And school in and of itself is a lot of work. Like, so when I see people who are doing ministry and like actual full-time ministry and also going to school, I'm like, mad props to you. Because it's like, you just do so much. Like there's so much reading, so much writing. And I remember I would schedule out pretty much my hour of what I'm doing each hour because it was just so busy.
Wow.
And so coming out of that and stepping into full-time ministry was just like different. I don't know, like, cause you're just studying so much. And then ministry is not about books. It's not about writing papers. It's about being with people.
Right.
So I think there had to be somewhat of a mindset of how do I take everything that I learned and apply that to ministering to people or sharing life with people or just being in the day to day of caring and loving your members. So it's one of those that's, how do I put it? Took some time getting used to. And then knowing how to take everything that feels so abstract and very technical, and saying that how does this relate to just people? Because not everyone's going to know Greek. Not everyone's going to know Hebrew. Not everyone's going to care about those things, and that's okay. But how do I say like, oh, these are the things that I've learned in seminary, whether it's the languages or whether it's church history or whether it's how to exegete a passage. And then I think because seminarians love just being like, oh my gosh, I never saw that in scripture. Like, oh, that is so amazing. But then you ask the question, and I love what my seminary professor said. He said, after you read scripture and you exegete it, you have to ask a question, so what? And I thought that was a good question because you're like so excited about this stuff, but you're like, okay, so what do I do with this now? How does this make me love people more? How does this make me love God more? How does this go into discipleship? So I don't know. I think that's something I'm still learning. And I'm sure it's something that all Christians will have to learn of. How do we unite what we know about God and how that plays out just into our daily lives? How does knowing some passage and the intricacies of it play into what fears I have or my lack of trust in the Lord or my unbelief? Yeah, so it's a process, and I feel like I'm still learning that and trying to understand that.
Right, because it's like the age-old like transition things from your head into your heart.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
like not only do you have to do that for yourself, right, on the daily, but it's like you're pastoring others to apply that in their lives too.
Yeah,
it's such an interesting position. Which leads me to my next question, which is like, did you grow up in a Christian family or?
I did.
Okay, so then becoming a pastor, like how has that changed your perspective on church?
In what way? What do you mean?
Like being, I guess like I'm in my head, right? It's like one thing to be a part of a congregation and to feel like, or there maybe even in this sense, like there are pastors that I can look up to, or like that I can talk to, or I can go to, and like things like that. But now being a part of the church or serving in the church, like being very involved, you see more of some of the logistical side of things, right? But also more of the day-to-day like grind, I guess, in a sense of like actually serving. So has that like changed your perspective on like church, the people in the church, things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some things are people still the same because as disciples, we're called to love God and love the church, or love God's people. So those are people outside the church too. And so I feel like that plays into pastoral ministry so much. And I've always been a big proponent of pastors are there to equip the church. I think sometimes people think like pastors should be doing everything. They're the ones to disciple. They're the ones to counsel. They're the ones to evangelize. They're the ones to teach. But I don't think that's what it is. I think that's why the body is there. I think all Christians should be disciple makers, should be studying about God, reading their Bible, and sharing with their like coworkers, neighbors, church members. And so what I see for pastoral ministry is just pastors are there to just equip people to be able to live out whatever gifting that they have. And so I think that's always such a tough balance because you do feel a little bit of the pressure of like, oh, we just got to do everything. But I think that's something that I feel like GCC does really well in. That we're like, hey, as much as we would love to do everything, we need your guys' help. We need it. We need the body. And so I think now being in pastoral ministry, you kind of see the ins and outs of what a pastor is. Because I remember coming in and everyone would ask me, hey, what does a pastor do? Like, are you just there on Sunday and Fridays and at prayer meetings, and is that it? And I think a lot of people don't know that there's so many different hats that pastors wear. So the staff has to be the ones that coordinate for events. And just simply coordinating for an event takes so much planning. There's a lot of meetings that we're a part of, meeting ministry team leaders or meeting within the staff themselves or meeting with our respective ministries. And so there's that. And then things like, you don't realize that even this home at the ministry center, someone's got to take care of it. And it's usually the staff that takes care of it. And so I think all that to say that now being on the flip side, now being a pastor, you see that it's more than just preaching, teaching, praying. But it's a lot of logistics, a lot of coordinating, a lot of meetups, a lot of counseling. So there's just a variety of things that people just don't realize. Or like things like when we used to have vans where you would have to take to the shop. Like, who's going to take it to the shop? That was us, you know? And so there's like a lot of small things that people don't realize. But now that I'm on this side, I see like, oh, there's a lot. And I'm glad that the church is there to help. And I feel like it should be something the church should all step into, be the body.
I suppose going off of that response, which I do want to transition soon into talking about GCC through your 5 years, but still talking a little bit about yourself. It sounds like, because it's a lot of work, right? It's almost like being in tech and being on call, right? You just always have to be present. So how have you found, I suppose, like rhythms of rest, right, through all this? Or what even was the process for you, right, in learning to rest and take time? Or like, yeah, what does that look like in a position of like pastoral ministry where like a lot of the work, a lot of the burden falls on you for better or for worse or for good reason or for not, right?
Yeah. I think one of the things that I've had to keep in mind is that God is ultimately the one who's going to take care of the church. And I think that's helpful because as staff, you always feel like you could do more. Like you could spend more time prepping for a sermon or prepping for an FNL or spend more time meeting with people or reaching out. And so there's always more that you can do. And so knowing that God is in control, I feel like it helps you to be like, it's okay not to be everything to everyone. And so that means you have to guard your time with your friends. If you have a family, your time with your family, time to yourself. And so I think guarding that time is something that every staff member has to kind of learn. It's a bit of a dance. And so one of the ways that here at GCC we've done it is take Mondays to Sabbath. And everyone would do it a little bit different. But pretty much for me is I didn't do any like church work or answer any church emails on Mondays. I would still read my Bible because I still need to spend time with the Lord. I would maybe, me and some of the staff used to go on like hikes sometimes on Mondays, or we would get away at a park or doing things that we just enjoy doing. I remember a couple years ago, I was like, okay, so what are the things that stir my affections for Jesus? Those are the things I kind of want to pursue after on a day-to-day, but also on my Sabbath. And so I used to fix bikes. And I loved just working on bikes on Mondays. And that's something I looked forward to. Other things is Mondays I would sleep in, wouldn't have an alarm. That was really helpful for me too. And so I think it's just guarding that time that helped me to rest. And that was helpful later on. One, that it shows that like the Lord doesn't really need me. Even if I take a day of rest, the church is going to be okay. But also knowing that I'm also human and I need to do the things like eat well, exercise, sleep well, and being able to know that that's necessary for all people, especially pastors too.
Exercise. Am I allowed to say pastor biceps on the?
I wonder how many people know that now, but I'm not sure.
Surprisingly enough, I think you were the one who told me about that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Like I think like 4 years ago, we got like dinner one time and you're like, oh yeah, work out. People call me Pastor Biceps sometimes.
Yeah, I don't know how that caught on. It like was really strange things. It wasn't like I was jacked or anything. But I just remember when I first came in, these college students, I don't even know how long ago it was, maybe 4 years ago. They would be like, oh, PB. And then it changed it to Pastor Biceps. And then changed to like every like meeting, they would zoom in and take a picture of my bicep. But I don't know. I'm just trying to stay fit, you know. I'm just trying to stay healthy. There's a lot of other staff members who are more jacked than I am. Like
More jacked than you.
Joey.
Joey.
Yeah.
But I guess that's in a strange way segues us into talking about how GCC has been these past few years. So like, what's like one of the biggest changes, or like maybe not biggest change, maybe that's a poor way of framing it, but like, what's like how was GCC like 5 years ago, and how have you seen it shifting or like moving in the time since you've got here, like either culturally or like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, well, our lead pastor has changed. And so I do think that whoever's on the staff will also dictate culture. And so when I first came in, I think, man, I don't even know how to explain it. I think we definitely, there's some strong points and some weak points. I think the strong things is, it seemed like when I first came in, everyone was like going hard. Like we would have like Saturday service meeting every weekend. We would have a lot of different events. Sunday service would go from whatever time it was to like 1 p.m. Because Pyong loved praying and loved like stretching out that time. And I think that those were good times, and I think it was necessary for where we were during that time. But there was also some weaknesses in that too. There was no structure. There was seemed like a lot of people were getting tired a little bit, maybe more quicker. And so I think what I've seen a little bit now is, I don't know if I would say it's healthier, but in some ways it feels that way. It seems a little bit more integrated. And so I think that's something that I've noticed now, where we're not sleeping at 4 a.m. every retreat, or even at every like passion conference or whatever it is. And even if you look at like worship team, they used to come out like 4 hours earlier, 4 hours later, but it's not like that as much. And so I think those are good things. I think it creates people to be a little bit more healthier. And so that's something that I experienced. And so I think that's something that as staff we've tried to do, is how do you create rhythms of rest as well? So that when people do serve and when they do step into whatever setting that they're in, whether it's school or whether it's jobs, they can feel empowered to be able to do those things and not just be tired from church work. And so I think that's something else that I've seen. Other things, I mean, we've gone through staff changes. So I feel like even Pastor Chris I was serving with him in college ministry. Then he became the young adult pastor. Then he's out in mainline. And there's been a bit of flip-flop. And so I think I've seen those as well. But I think the heart of GCC has always stayed the same. Wanting to make disciples, wanting to be prayerful, wanting to be spirit-led, wanting to be saturated in the word. I think those things have been the same all throughout, which I really appreciate. And so in some ways it still feels like the same GCC, but in other ways it feels like we've adapted. And I think that's been a good thing, especially coming out of COVID too. I think it's always hard to know like, oh, like how do we get out of COVID? But I think I've seen us transition out of that well, and know like with Pastor Doug now here, like what does the Lord have in store for us? Like we don't want to go back to the old GCC, but we want to be able to take what we see the Lord doing and also the gifts of GCC and be able to mesh those things together so we know what the Lord has in store for us next and kind of step into that season.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about COVID next too, right? Because every ministry that I know of, right, which it's quite a lot at the time, like really struggled through COVID. And I think even being a part of GCC, I could see that was like no different. So like what changes do you feel like something like COVID like really I had a word on the tip of my tongue again, but I forgot what it was. It was like some chemistry word, like catalysis or whatever. I forget. But catalyzed. There we go. Yes. What changes do you feel like COVID like catalyzed or like forced in a sense, right? Or started in the church, and like as a pastor of the church, right, and also being very, I suppose, involved with people, right? How have you seen like our congregation like begin to adapt to things like that and pull out of that? And I don't want to say recover, right? Because recover sounds like we're returning to an old state, right?
Sure.
As you just mentioned, but like grow from that experience.
So like how has COVID helped, like what has COVID done to help us grow as a church?
Yes. It's almost like, because like it's easy to view COVID as just a negative, right? It's like, maybe church size has gone down or like whatever, right? But like like looking back, it's almost like what you intended for evil, God intended for good, right? In Genesis 50. So it's like what good has come out of COVID for churches that you've seen?
I think one of the good things that have come out of COVID is where people have started to think about what is really important in life, especially within context of church. Because when COVID happened, everything shut down. So you didn't really need to go to church. You didn't really need to, like, no one was there to like be like, hey, where were you at church? Or where were you at family group, a Bible study? Or where were you at this? And so I felt like in some ways, people had to think about like post-COVID, now that everything is opening up, do I want to be a part of that or not? Or why should I be a part of that? And so I think that's something that, at least for myself, I had to really think about, even as staff, like, hey, what things do we want to do? Because we don't want to do it just because we've always done it. But now looking at the state of the church, now looking at our members, what do we think is necessary? What do you think is important? And so I think that's something that has been good for the church. Saying like, oh, why is it that we should come to Sunday service in person? Because it's life-giving. Because there's something different from experiencing church on Zoom virtually versus church in person, where you can interact with people. You have to talk to people. You have physical touch. You have just people that you can be like, hey, you want to hang out afterwards? And all of those things are necessary. And so I think that's what people start thinking about a little bit more. And I think that's one of the good things that have happened because of COVID, that you see like, oh, actually church is really important. Oh, actually being with people is a part of how God designed us. And so I think that's one of the good things that have happened.
What would be your advice for us, right, as a congregation, to be able to compassionately and effectively walk with other people? Because the place that this question comes from is like, throughout my college experience, like I didn't really know you all that much, right? Because I wasn't super involved in GCC because I was in other ministries, but it was like every time someone talked about talking to PB, it would be because I have a problem, so now I have to go talk to PB. Right? Sure, I don't know if that's like necessarily indicative of your experience, right? But that's the sense that I got, right? So memes aside, right? It's like how, like, being a person who a lot of people go to, right, for wisdom, for advice, and a lot of times for sympathy too, right? I imagine. How do we effectively do that as a congregation, right? Walk with someone else who's struggling, help someone through a problem that they may have, right? Like how should we approach these sorts of situations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think something that I'm learning now, and I wish maybe I knew a little bit earlier, is that as Christians or as believers, I think one of the best ways we can walk with people is simply to just be with them. I think I have this tendency, and I'm sure many people will have this tendency, is, hey, come to me with a problem, I'll give you a solution. Like, hey, are you struggling with this? This is how you fix it. And I feel like it's so black and white when life isn't like that. And I started to understand why God actually came onto earth and was with his people, because there's a lot of value just being with people. And even if you see maybe the way that Jesus ministered, he wasn't just like, you have a problem, boom, gone. This is the solution, leave. But he's actually with his people for some time. And I think that's where I'm learning. They say, don't get people to behave better, get people to love the Savior more. And I think that's something that I always have to like have that in the back of my head if I'm meeting with someone. Rather than be, hey, just tell me your problems. I'm like, hey, I've been there. This is how I solved it. But in reality, there are some things in my life I haven't fully solved yet. And maybe we'll never fully solve on this side of heaven. So then it's like, how do I just be Jesus on flesh to them? How am I just present with them? How do I just listen to what they're struggling with? How do I help them to trust God more, or help them to just grow a little bit more in their walk with God, rather than being like, you're sinning, you're not sinning. And so, yeah, it's a challenge that I feel like I'm still trying to navigate through and trying to learn about what does it mean for me to just be present with people, to understand them, to empathize with them, to not be like, hey, that's wrong and you got to fix it right now, to be like, hey, so how did you end up there? What got you to that place? Because everyone's journey is so different. And the reason people struggle with sin could be very different too. So if someone struggles with lying or with greed, there's so many different reasons someone might be struggling with that. It could be their background. It could be their personality. It could be the ways that grew up. It could be what concept they have of God. And so because of that, it's hard for me to give now a solution to be like, hey, this is how you fix it. That might have worked for me with my temperament, my personality, my background, but that person probably didn't have those same things or doesn't have those same things. And so it's really like understanding people, knowing them, knowing that it's going to be a journey and it's okay that they don't fix it right away. So just knowing them, loving them, walking with them where they are, and then trusting that God is ultimately going to sanctify them. And so it's a place of surrender as well.
So then in light of basically the current direction the discussion is going, like, where would you want our church to be? Like, I guess it's hard to say like, oh, in perpetuity or like super far in the future, but it's like, if you were to come back in like 5 years, right, or so, like, what parts of the culture or like things that we're doing now would you want to see continued or like, I guess even like magnified? And what sort of other things would you like to see like change in the culture in some sense?
I think the first thing that comes to mind that I would love GCC to continue to grow in is ownership. And I've mentioned it before, where I feel like it's the church that should be the body, meaning it shouldn't be just the staff. It shouldn't be just Pastor Doug, but it should be everyone living out God's kingdom. And so I think that's something that I would love to just see more of, whether it's hangouts, that it's not staff run, but it's more of members are like, hey, we just want to hang out. Can we do this thing? Or whether it's like ministry team leads, instead of being like, hey, so what should we do? Be like, hey, this is an idea I want to have and I want to run with it. It's where they have ownership of like, hey, this is my church. This is my community. And I want to use my gifts, my resources, my thought processes, like all of it to help the church to thrive and to grow. And so that's something that I would love to see more of. Because I think that there's still a bit of like, everyone looks to kind of staff like, hey, is this okay? Or like, should we do this? Or, hey, can you do this? But rather than being like that, I feel like the church has to be like, hey, what can I do that would help people grow, help people to love Jesus more? Or whatever that is. And I see it happening really well right now. But I'm like, hey, continue to do that. Like,
Right.
take ownership, like plan things out. Ask the staff, hey, can we do this stuff? I think staff loves when people do that, rather than being like, hey, we have this idea, can you execute it? And so I think that's something I would love to see more. Something that I would love to see change. I don't know. I feel like GCC is in such a great spot.
That's fair.
There's nothing I would be like, oh, I see that like it's blatantly wrong. Maybe one of the things that I would speak more for this generation of believers is where we know the Bible less and less. And maybe because we're coming from a post-Christendom world where like everyone was Christian, everyone was reading the Bible, everyone's doing that, but now it's not like that as much in this generation. So I think something that I would love to see GCC to grow in more is just getting into the Word and really asking, like, what is the author's intent in this book, rather than being like, oh, I'm just going to make something up and that's okay. Because there is a specific like meaning or purpose or whatever. The book was written for a certain reason. You can't just make them something up. It's exegesis, not eisegesis. And so I think that's something I would love to see more. And that happen maybe on their own personal lives, but also in family group. I know young adults are doing inductive. I think that's great because it helps you to understand the author's intent. But I think that's something I would love to see. Yeah, I'd love to see that. And then I think the last thing is to continue to hold on to the prayer culture of GCC, where we'd love to see people come out to the prayer meetings to say, hey, we want to intercede for the church, or maybe on their own time to be praying for the church. I would love to see the body intercede for GCC and for this city and for this community as well. So I think I would encourage that.
What would be your, I guess, like advice for new people here in GCC? Right. I guess we can split it into college and young adult. So like, new people coming to college, right? What would you say to them as they approach that new stage of life? And what would you say to young adults too, as they transition from college into young adult life? What would be your encouragement for them?
I guess the advice I would give probably could be applicable to both, but I think for college students, I would say really seek after the Lord during your college years. Because I've seen that transit really transform my life of where I feel like I just want to go all out. And because it's a season where if you grew up in the church, then your parents might have told you, hey, we got to go to church, or maybe that's something that you did culturally. But college is the first time where you have a choice of what you want to do with your time. So you can go to church, you cannot go to church. You can invest in people who love the Lord, and you don't have to. But I feel like I've seen in my life, I've seen in so many people's, college people's lives of, hey, if you invest into the Lord, there is great reward in that. You won't regret that at all. And so I say, get plugged in, find people who love the Lord and share life with them. Just use, it can be easy. You can pursue so many other things, you know? And I think, study hard and work hard, but also take the time in college to seek after the Lord. And then for young adults, I would say, for those who just graduate college, I would say, hey, it's okay if it's tough transitioning. I think a lot of young adults are surprised by that because they're like, why is it so hard? Or why can I not my community? And why is it so difficult? And I think that's such a normal experience. But I would say, hey, don't let that discourage you from continually trying. And so for the young adults, I say, invest into people and be intentional about it. Because it's not going to come as easy as it did in college, because you don't live with people the same way, you know, and you're not with them like 20%, you're not taking classes with them unless maybe you're in grad school. But I would say, prioritize that in your life and building community, and also prioritize being a light into your workplaces or your schools, and but be intentional about it, and don't be discouraged if you don't see it happening right away.
Well, I suppose we are coming up against the end of our time, which means that I get to ask the questions that I want to ask.
I'm a little scared now.
So, PV, I know you're a big reader, right? So what are, like, if I've never read a book aside from the Bible in my life, what are the top 5 books that you think
Top 5
that I should read?
Oh man, that's a tough question. Top 5 books. That's a tough one because I feel like depending where you're at, there's different books for it.
Sure.
I'm like blanking now. What books I've read? I read so many books. I just can't even remember any.
His mind's a library.
Knowing God by J.I. Packer. I think it's a great book. About like just pursuing after God. I think How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. It's a great book to understand the Bible, which I would highly recommend. Because sometimes people don't know, like, how do I read this book? They don't know each book in the Bible is a different genre. I think that's another one I would recommend. Right now, reading Prodigal God by Tim Keller. I know I shared that with you before. That's a great one that I would recommend as well. Yeah, I don't know. I think those are the ones that come to mind right now. But I'm sure there's a lot. I love Jackie Hill Perry's Gay Girl, Good God. That was really helpful for me, and to just, I don't know, for various reasons, I really enjoyed it. Just the way that she writes, and the way that she talks about maybe like the ways that we understand God or idols or things like that. I think that was really helpful. And then the last one I would say is, I'm not sure. I'd have to get back to you. Ask me later.
I'll ask you later.
I'll look at my list of books that I've read and I'll recommend one.
So more things for me to add to my list. Then I guess the next question that I want to ask for my own, for myself, is, or maybe this is a little bit general too. What did the calling into ministry look like specifically for you? Because I feel like a lot of pastors will just say, I got called into ministry, I felt the Lord, whatever. But like, what did it look like specifically for you? Like, how did you know?
Yeah, so I know some pastors who are like, hey, I got a dream, I got a vision, I got this supernatural thing, and they felt really convicted by it, and then they kind of went with it. That wasn't my experience. My experience was a little bit more stretched out. So I felt like first the inclination of like, oh, it would be kind of nice to go into ministry my senior year in high school, but it was kind of a more fleeting thought. And then my freshman and sophomore year, that desire into ministry just grew. I just thought about it a lot. I was like, man, I feel this tugging on my heart to go into it. But I'm also a very skeptical kind of person. So I'm like, how do I know? And so I think it was helpful for me that you want to have 3 things to know your calling. First is, do you have an internal desire? And internal desire that is continued. Because I've seen guys who are like, I want to go into ministry, and kind of spur of the moment, like, I feel it. And then you ask them a couple months later, they're like, I don't have it, you know? But a continual desire to go into ministry. Second, I think it should be affirmed by the church. Meaning God has created us to have a body. There are people above us, people next to us, that we want to ask, hey, do you see this calling in us? And so they might be like, hey, we don't think you have that calling. So then if those are the people over you, then you'd be like, oh, maybe I should listen to them, or maybe they have something that I should be thinking about. And I think the last thing is, are there open doors? Because it could be like you feel this desire, everyone's, hey, go for it, but the Lord might not be opening that door right away, and maybe you'll be called in a bit of a later time. So I think all of those things start matching up for me my sophomore year where I feel this desire, and people are like, "Hey, we affirm that calling in you." But I didn't feel called to go into seminary, like I said, until a couple years later. But the interesting thing for me is, though, even though I felt that desire to feel like, oh, I want to switch, I feel like called into it. It wasn't until my second year in seminary school where I feel like, oh, this is actually it. I think I just doubted the entire time. I was like, shouldn't everyone want to teach the Bible? Shouldn't everyone want to equip the church? So it was my sophomore year where I felt like, through various circumstances, conversations, where I felt like this is where I feel that the Lord is calling me.
Wow. It's incredible. My last question, which is totally unrelated to anything that we've discussed so far. How did you get into coffee? And what's your favorite roast? And what, if you have a preferred bean, right? Or like growing region?
Okay. Yeah. So people, when they meet me, they think I'm a coffee snob, but I would drink any coffee. You just got to lay that straight.
No, you're a coffee snob, dude. You roast your own beans.
No, I will drink Dunkin'. I love Dunkin'. I love Starbucks. No, so I started, I never really got into coffee until I actually went to seminary school.
Okay.
And I started learning about coffee a little bit more. And then I had some friends who were like, hey, we started roasting. So I was like,
coffee and Jesus.
Yeah. I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. Like, how did you guys start roasting? And I started doing some research, talking to people, and they started with a popcorn roaster, popper kind of thing. And you can find them at thrift stores, but you have to have a certain one that circulates air in a certain way. And then I started seeing that buying green beans, which you use to like roast your coffee, is significantly cheaper than going out and buying bags of coffee. And so all of those things combined is kind of fun. I started in seminary school having a popcorn roaster, and it was the craziest process, but a lot of fun. And through that, I started getting into it. That's when I started learning about like, what is a V60, a pour over, or how do you use a Chemex or a Mocha Pot or whatever it is. And I think I just loved coffee and loved drinking it, and then transitioned from a popcorn roaster to an actual roaster. And after that, I'm like, there's no point in me buying coffee anymore. But it's something that I just enjoy, something that's a lot of fun. I'm not the type that can drink a cup of coffee and be like, these are all the taste notes. It feels like molasses and strawberries and chocolate. I'm just like, it just tastes good and I like it. I love light roast more than anything else. I think it just tastes the best. And I feel like there's less margin. Like if you go to Starbucks and you get a dark roast, it might be burnt.
That's true.
So I always go for the light roast because I feel like it just tastes a little bit better.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's how I got into it. I enjoy it. It's cheaper.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of fun. And so I think the region that I like the most is Colombia. Yeah. I just like the flavor profile of that, but I always try different ones, and who knows what I like next.
Not a snob, but knows exactly where he wants his beans from.
No, not a snob.
I like Colombian beans that are picked at this time of the year.
No, I'm still definitely learning. I would still drink Dunkin'. Yes, I still.
What if Dunkin's from Colombia?
Yes, only from Colombia.
No. But anyways, thank you so much for your time, PV. I really appreciate it. Thanks for sharing your story and just all these random nuggets and tidbits as well. With that being said, we are Grace Covenant Chats and produced by Grace Covenant Church. Oh, we are not Grace Covenant Chats. We are Grace Covenant Church here in Philly, producing Grace Covenant Chats. I always have to remember my outros every time too. It's like I should have it written down by now, but I don't. If you're new here, please go and check us out at philly.gracecovenant.net. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today, and we will see you next time.